Hello, I'm Nate Reiger, your host for the Compassionate Accountability Podcast. I'm the founder and CEO of Next Element, a global consulting and training firm helping organizations transform their cultures with compassionate accountability. I'm the author of 4 books about compassionate work, including my new book, Compassionate Accountability: How Leaders Build Connection and Get Results. Thank you for joining me. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review to help us reach more listeners. And be sure to visit our website at next-element.com, where you can learn more about the work we do, as well as all of the previous podcast episodes. This is the last episode of the Compassionate Accountability Podcast before I take a break for my research sabbatical. And we're definitely ending on a high note. My guest is Amy Edmonson, one of the most noted experts in the study of high-performing teams and somebody who deeply appreciates the power of compassionate accountability in leadership. Dr. Edmondson is the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at the Harvard Business School, where her focus is in the study of human interactions that lead to the creation of successful enterprises that contribute to the betterment of society. She studies teaming, psychological safety, and organizational learning, and her articles have been published in numerous academic and management outlets. Dr. Edmondson has been recognized by the biannual Thinkers 50 Global Ranking of Management Thinkers since 2011, and most recently was ranked number 1 in 2021 and 23. She also received the organization's Breakthrough Idea Award in 2019 and Talent Award in 2017. Amy is the pioneer in the field of psychological safety and its role in high-performing teams. Her book, The Fearless Organization: Creating Psychological Safety in the Workplace for Learning, Innovation, and Growth, has been translated into 15 languages. Her newest book, Right Kind of Wrong, builds on her prior work on psychological safety and teaming to provide a framework for thinking about, discussing, and practicing the science of failing well. First published in 2023, this book is due to be translated into 24 additional languages and was selected for the Financial Times and Schroders Best Business Book of the Year award. Wow. I've followed Amy's work for many years, and when I read her newest book, which brought together the science of psychological safety and failing well, I saw so many connections with compassionate accountability. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. Amy, welcome to the Compassionate Accountability Podcast.
Thrilled to be here.
It's really an honor to have you here. And, I've been following your work for so long, and it took a bit to get connected with you. And so I appreciate you so much making the time to explore this topic of failing well and for coming on my show. I want to start with just a brief history. My listeners really like to know how my guests came to be interested in what it is they're passionate about. So what's kind of the 30-second history of how you got interested in this topic of failure?
Oh my. Well, I guess the short answer is from personal experience with failure and trying to put it together in a way that saw the value rather than just the disappointment in failures. And more specifically in my early, before I became an academic, I was a consultant and working with organizations in change programs and team effectiveness programs. And it just became clear to me that learning was the order of the day, right? That organizations, to be effective in a changing world, and I know this is obvious, have to keep learning. And then what are one of the most important inputs to learning? Well, failures, of course.
Yeah. Wow. And right now, this podcast is going to go live in probably March of 2025. We'll probably remember this quarter for a long time as another area of disruption and change and plenty of opportunities to fail. So let's start with your definition of failure, or maybe are there different kinds of failure?
Yes. So first, my definition of failure, which is a very large and encompassing concept, is an undesired outcome, right? So that covers a lot of territory. And as you suggested, I've identified 3 kinds of failure: basic failure, complex failure, and intelligent failure. Small hint, only the intelligent failure are really the good kind, the celebratory kind. The basic failure is a failure in familiar territory where you make a mistake that's really preventable, right?
Mm,
You text and drive and get into an accident. That's a basic failure. Don't do it, right?
yeah,
We don't want to celebrate those kinds of failures. You're making cookies and you put in salt instead of sugar. Like, no, right? It's
yeah,
not it's wasteful.
right.
Complex failures are those perfect storms, those failures that happen increasingly in our lives and in our organizations because a handful of factors conspire to make something go
Mhm,
wrong,
mhm.
again, in an undesired way, but in a way that's a bit more complex and still preventable often, but not as readily and simply preventable. And an
And
intelligent failure is unique, right?
yeah,
That's the undesired result of a thoughtful experiment.
yeah. That's actually become a little mantra in our team meetings right now. Our executive team, we're having to do a lot of pivoting, a lot of adjusting, and sometimes the question is, how could we set up an intelligent failure here? How do we want to craft it? And a
Right.
shout out again for your book, Failing Well, or right, wrong, right kind of wrong, is that you lay out such a great articulation of these differences, and you go further and talk about, so how do we set up systems and processes and plan for failures to be intelligent? And I really appreciate that. One of the things that is a big theme in your book, and I know it comes from other research, is the importance of psychological safety. You're a pioneer in this field, and will you share a little bit about what role does psychological safety play in failing well?
Actually, psychological safety plays a big role in failing well across that spectrum of different failure types and different context types. So I think psychological safety plays a huge role in helping us prevent those failures that we can and will and should want to prevent in the following way. When people speak up, often so many of the failures I've studied could have been prevented had someone felt able to speak up in a timely way
Mhm.
about a tentative concern, right? A sort of, not quite sure this is right, or this gives me a little worry, but then again, who am I? I don't know enough
Right.
to raise it, and it doesn't feel welcome for some reason around here. So it's, job one for psychological safety in the science of failing well is preventing that which can be prevented. I don't like
Mm.
waste, right?
Yeah.
And then the other part, the other big part is the willingness to take risks, to try new things that might work, but might not. And, most people would rather be safe than sorry, or that's probably not the right phrase, but would rather get it right than potentially do something even bigger and more exciting. So it's it's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
about saying, you know what? Here is a perfect safe context for trying new things. Again, no bigger than necessary because new things might fail. And so when they fail, they bring us new information, but let's not make it more expensive than it has to
Yeah.
be.
Well, I can think of a personal, real example from yesterday. We publish a biweekly newsletter, and we're trying to think about, are there any ways we want to reach out to our community, to our constituency, to offer support and resources during times of transition? And I'd written the intro to the newsletter, and one of my colleagues called me and she said, something doesn't feel right about the theme and the tone of your introduction, but I
Huh,
know how hard you worked on it. And I just want to say something, but I don't want you to be mad because you've worked so hard on it. And in that moment, what I realized is now is the time for psychological safety
right,
because she's coming forward with something in her gut that could be supremely helpful for us. So how I respond now really makes the
right.
difference on whether I'll hear from her again. Uh,
Exactly.
and her input turned out to be very important. And
Wow.
so,
Wow.
uh,
I
but
mean, it's free, right? I mean, it should be free. People should
yeah.
not think of voice as costly because failures are costly.
Mm,
Preventable failures are costly. And so you always want to create the conditions where people will err on the side of, I'm not quite sure, but,
yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to raise this. And you don't have to agree with it. You don't have to turn over the reins. You just have to say, thanks for sharing that,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
then I'm gonna ponder it for a
Yeah.
moment. And here's what I'm thinking. What do you think of that? Right? it's engaging in what I call high quality conversations as often as possible. And that's
Yeah.
particularly important in times of uncertainty.
Yeah. Well, and the standards keep going up. The competition keeps getting higher. And one of the quotes from your book, you said, insisting on high standards without psychological safety is a recipe for failure. And for us, this is an example of what I call compassionate accountability. And you've just described why this is so important. But inherent in that is conflict. So when my colleague calls me and says, I'm experiencing a gap between what I think is the right thing to do and what I'm seeing in your writing,
Yeah.
there's conflict. How does conflict, will you talk about where conflict
Yep.
fits in all this?
I mean, it's conflict is one word for it that's accurate. It's also it's uncomfortable. It's it's not fun to call someone up and say, or to in a meeting room to say, I think you've done this wrong, or I think there's a gap between what you're saying and what you're doing. I mean, that will never be fun for us fallible human
Yeah.
beings, right? But because we are passionate enough about our mission or what's at stake, or our collective desire to do the best we possibly can under the circumstances, we're willing to do those uncomfortable
Yeah.
things. We're willing to engage in conflict. I mean, most of us, or at least to varying degrees, are a little bit conflict averse.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, we'd rather not have conflict than have it. However, that's not a recipe for excellence, right? So a recipe for excellence is we're going to have conflicts and we need to process them as effectively as possible. And to me, this is a matter of, there are interpersonal skills that can help us do that well. And
Yeah.
they're very important for innovation. They're very important for just pure execution as well.
Well, I didn't plan to do this, but since you brought up this topic of that conflict can actually be a catalyst if we do it well, use it well. I want to give a shout out to, we're going to be publishing a survey on understanding the relationship between trust and conflict. And it's
Oh,
our feeling is that conflict, most people are averse to it. But one of the things about conflict is when you do it well, you actually build trust. It's pretty amazing to be able to count on your neighbor to do healthy conflict with you.
right.
So anyway,
Right.
shout out for that. But that's not about today. So mindset. I want to talk about mindset. You reference quite a bit mindset. Specifically, you talk about Carol Dweck's work with growth versus fixed. Amazing stuff. We've identified what we call the compassion mindset, and I want to run it by you to see how it fits with
Great.
your understanding of failure. So the compassion mindset views people as capable or valuable, capable, and responsible. And three are all important. So I see a lot of parallels in what you're talking about. Treating people as valuable means we assume positive intentions and we foster a safe place to bring your full self. Treating people as capable means we invite exploration and curiosity and problem solving instead of thinking, oh, we have it all figured out. And we accept failure as part of the process of learning. But the responsibility part means we have to take ownership over our part. And you talk about that, is that most importantly, we ask ourselves, what can we do next to learn to prevent it from happening again, to increase the quality and the outcomes? So it seems that a mindset of seeing ourselves and others as valuable, capable, and responsible could be pretty important for failing well. What's your perspective on that?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I love that definition and construction of a compassion mindset. The mindset shift that I've spent the most time thinking about is the shift from knowing to learning, which is certainly related, it's tightly related to Carol Dweck's work on fixed versus sort of growth mindset. But it's very specifically recognizing that and I think this encompasses, or at least includes, makes room for the compassion mindset that you're describing, because it has to remind, my aim is to remind us that we have a spontaneous reaction of knowing.
Yeah.
Like even in this moment, I see you, I'm with you, recording a podcast. I have this general sense that I know, right? That I know what's going on. I know what question you just asked and what you intended from it. It's like it's automatic.
Yeah.
I've got to keep pushing myself to shift from the knowing to the learning, which is, like, what am I missing? Like,
Yeah.
what did he really want or mean? Or, what's really happening here so that I can learn and grow and I can contribute as well as I can. So I can be more valuable, I can be more responsive to the actual needs of the situation
Yeah.
rather than to what my biases and past and expertise tell me. The
Yeah.
button that you just pushed that I say, okay, I'll give you that answer. It's like, no, can I actually be present and genuinely learn? Can we learn together?
Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
the argument is, and this is in chapter 5 of the book, that we have this default knowing, but we can shift to learning, and it's very powerful. And it's powerful both for preventing unwanted failures and for producing smart experiments.
Yeah. I love that. And near the end of the book, you kind of say, well, what does it really come down to for me? And you shared that knowing versus learning versus knowing. I love that. I think Stephen Covey said, be a learn it all, not a know it all.
Yes,
And
yes.
I love that.
It
So
came from
yeah,
Satya Nadella, I think, or maybe the other way around. But he,
yeah,
as the then when he was new CEO a little over a decade ago at Microsoft, said, I really want to, he wanted to change the culture from a culture of know-it-alls, very
yeah,
smart people doing amazing stuff, but to a culture of learn-it-alls.
yeah.
Big
I
shift.
love that. So it really is about curiosity, and how do we
Yep.
cultivate that? How do we maintain that? And in that space of failure. One of the messages that I think is a really bit of a mindset shift for a lot of readers could be that you repeat this throughout the book, is that our goal should not necessarily be to eliminate failure errors, but to foster better reporting. And in your research on psychological safety, one of the things you found is that high performing teams don't necessarily make fewer errors, but they report them at a higher rate. And will you unpack that a little bit about why
Sure.
this is so profound?
Well, we're so used to, maybe in part because we're knowers, right, to assuming that when you see the data or you see the reports, or here's a team reporting mistakes and here's a team not reporting mistakes, what does your brain do? It immediately
Yeah.
says, well, the team reporting mistakes is poor performer. They have all these mistakes. The other team, no mistakes. Oh, they must be really good. When in fact, we don't know for sure, but it could be exactly the opposite, right? It could be that the ones who are reporting are wise enough to know that, yes, we work in a complex error-prone system. Things will go wrong. The quicker we report, the quicker we catch, and the safer our patients or customers or whoever are. Or, it could be that this team that we're not hearing anything from are in fact perfect.
Yeah.
Now, my money is on the former explanation, right?
Yeah.
Because I just haven't met that many perfect people or perfect teams. And
Yeah.
so I get, especially there are some settings that are very routine. When I empty the dishwasher later today, I don't expect to have lots of errors. I don't expect a lot of things to go wrong. It's a pretty straightforward activity. But a lot of the work we do together in our organizations is anything but straightforward. So
Yeah.
I would like to train people to be wary of the no news is good news mentality, like to be
Yeah.
wary of attributing excellence to the group that's reporting no mistakes, right? And saying, okay, let's just at least keep our curiosity open to the possibility that when we're not hearing the red, that doesn't mean the red doesn't exist.
Yeah. And your book has so many amazing stories and examples of companies that have done it well, not done it well, leaders who have learned and implemented changes. And so I think for listeners, if you're a leader and you're curious about this, the book offers some really great insights and strategies to make that more part of your culture. If you're just someone that wants to understand failure better, it's also an incredible book to be
Thank
able
you.
to do that. And I like how the book goes from understanding failure, then you start talking about the science, and then you go into strategies, structures, systems, because I know you've worked with a lot of companies at that kind of higher level consulting as well. I want to circle back. So you high level describe the three kinds of failure. Let's go back to intelligent failure. Will you give us a brief criteria? What
Yeah,
makes a failure intelligent?
yeah. Yes, because it's so funny because in a way I had to write this book and to write other things. I had to like, what's really necessary, like which criteria are really necessary, and which are just redundant or derivative from the others. And so here's where I arrived. And then I realized that the criteria, which I'm about to describe, are in fact also a playbook, right? They're a way that you can judge a failure after the fact. Was it intelligent or not? But they're also a playbook for how you can go have more smart experiments in your life or in your job. Okay, so here they are. Number one, it's in new territory.
Okay.
It means you can't just look up the formula for how to get the result you want on the internet or ask an expert, right? It just doesn't exist yet. And number two, it's in pursuit of a goal. You're not just messing around with resources for the fun of it, but there's a valued goal you're trying to reach or advance toward. Number three, you've done your homework, right? So it's not a matter of just throwing darts at the wall. It's about you've even though it's new territory, you've done what you need to do to find out what do we know, what do we not
Right.
know. And I don't want to make that sound like that's extensive and months of work. No, I mean just quickly pause to think. In fact, a better way to put that is you have a legitimate hypothesis. Like you have good reason to believe that this thing you're about to do that's in new territory
Right.
might work. Right. And then number four, so important, no bigger than necessary. So we want to keep our intelligent failures as small as possible, just
Right.
big enough to give us the new information, but not so big that we've wasted time, money that are always scarce
Yeah.
in their pursuit.
Oh, thank you. Great criteria. This invites me to consider when I hear leaders say failure is not an option.
Yeah.
And I wonder, it's like, okay, so what kind of failures have you been having if that's what you say? Because there are failures that are not an option,
Right.
like a plane
Right.
crash.
Right.
But there are failures that are actually an option that we wouldn't mind having if it's intelligent.
Right. Right. I mean,
Yeah.
that line, failure is not an option, is famously attributed to Gene Kranz, who I absolutely, admire, great leader at NASA during the Apollo era. And, he famously said failure is not an option. I think that often gets misinterpreted to mean, we're going to have no failures around here. And that's what good leadership looks like. No, I mean, what he was saying is, we all know what's at stake, right? There are some
Yeah.
lives hanging in the balance here. And
Yeah.
given our engineering talent, our ability to team up and solve new problems that we've never solved before, I am convinced we can do it,
Yeah.
right? And the thing that's not an option is not trying, not
Mm,
giving it your all, not caring enough to give it your all, to not caring enough to
yeah.
sort of say, here's a crazy idea maybe what I think it was in context a message of
Yeah.
great confidence in the team, not a message of you better not fail, right? And that we have to
Yeah.
be thoughtful
Yeah.
about that.
Well, that makes a lot of sense in the context too, because a country is hanging on every word. This is a big deal. The spouses of the astronauts want to know
Right,
that failure is not an option. I don't want
right,
that to be an option
right.
for you. Yeah.
But it's
So
not meant to be magical thinking.
yeah,
Like, we in order to prevent that failure, we really have to work as hard as we can right now. And let's be clear, it was in new territory.
yeah,
Nothing like this had ever happened before.
yeah,
So it was now, okay, what do we got? What do we try? What can we do to get them home safely? New goal and a valuable
yeah.
goal.
I want to shift gears to the vulnerability that is inherent in this whole process, and it's it's part of failure, it's part of coming forward, it's part of speaking up. And I want to kind of set the stage with a quote from Brene Brown that you share in the book. In section 2, you talk about practicing the science of failing well. And I want to just read this quote and then give you a chance to just share whatever's on your mind. She said, I believe that's what compassion really is, struggling with others through failure. We often misunderstand compassion and empathy. Well, actually, what I'm sharing is a response to the quote. You talk
Right.
about how important, she talks about how important vulnerability is. And I think in my view, that's what compassion is. It's not vulnerability in terms of weakness. It's vulnerability in terms of struggling with others. It's
Right.
not just empathy in action, like, oh, I see
Yeah.
your pain. I feel your pain. I want to go fix it for you. It's not that. It's about
It's with.
it's not, that's disempowering, but ultimately it's about getting alongside people
Yeah.
together to learn from failure. Will you talk a little bit about vulnerability in this context?
Yeah. I think for me, the biggest issue with vulnerability is the willingness to acknowledge that you're vulnerable. Like
Yeah.
the fact is you're vulnerable. I mean, we're all vulnerable to the vagaries of the
Right,
future that
right.
are coming at us that we can't fully control. So we are vulnerable. The question becomes, are you willing to acknowledge it to yourself and then to others? And I find that a really powerful thing to do because when you acknowledge it, especially to others, you open you open the doors for people to have more honest conversations, right? It
Yeah,
doesn't feel good to be vulnerable, but guess what?
yeah,
We are. So
yeah,
therefore, but it does feel good to connect with others
yeah,
on our vulnerability. And it's empowering because we can then find better ways. With your support, I can find a way out of you know, situation that I'm in that I can't seem to get out by myself. I need your help. And but I won't get your help unless I'm willing to acknowledge and
yeah,
ask for it.
yeah. And then it can be a self-reinforcing cycle. If I respond by fostering psychological safety, it makes it less scary. And so we
Right.
can continue to increase that. So we've worked with thousands of leaders in situations where they're failing all the time, failing while we're learning new things, not successful in a
Yeah.
simulation. And we do a lot around personality. And one of the things I noticed throughout your book is I sense that personality might play a role in how people approach failure and respond to failure. What's your view? You have any
Yeah.
research on that?
Well, I have to agree with you, and I don't have a lot of research on, I have a little bit. And I shy away from personality explanations because I might be wrong about this, but they indicate to me that, oh, well, if I wasn't born with that personality, I'm out of luck here,
Mhm.
right? And so, which is of course not what you're saying and not true, but so I like to frame these issues, these phenomena as skills rather than personality. Like in the same way that an extrovert is, you know, more geared to interact, with others,
Yeah,
doesn't mean an introvert doesn't know how or can't be extraordinarily good at it.
right.
Right. So I want to lean into the skill aspect of, thoughtful experiments, high quality
Right.
conversations, willingness to try new things or to, team up, right?
Yeah. Well, where I find it empowering is that based on my personality, I might have some natural proclivities, some natural inclinations, but being aware that, hey, that
That's
might be
true.
my default. It's like, okay, I'm aware of it. Now I can work on skills to be able
That's
to be more effective anyways. Uh,
That's well put. Yeah, that's really great. Because in fact,
yeah,
the good part about personality for me is that I think it's just inherently fascinating. Like I think we're all drawn toward and appreciate the typologies when they shed some light.
yeah,
You learn that you're this Briggs Myers or that Briggs, and you sort
yeah,
of
yeah,
go,
yeah,
yeah, right.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
me.
yeah,
And then you say, okay, well, what does that set me up for? Like it sets me up for some risks over here and some advantages over there. And then I can focus on developing skills to close the risks.
yeah, yeah. Well, I want to know again the right kind of wrong. It's all about learning the science and practice of failing well. And this book is just packed with so many things. I want listeners to know that your book's not just about, some interpersonal dynamics around failure, but it's packed with stories. And these stories by themselves are so empowering. But then you pull out the strategies and the applications and even down to, how do we design systems that support intelligent failure. So I love some of your tables. You have some really cool visuals. And some of them were kind of thick, like
Yeah,
dense, I'll have to
yeah.
admit, but some of them, it's just like, oh my gosh, yes. Do you have a favorite framework or visual from your book that you're just like, okay, that one just
Oh,
hits it?
well, let me give you two, right? So one is the page 64, the table, goes through the criteria. And to me, it's as I said, it's analytical, but it's also useful. And so that is, and I think it's an aha for most people. And an intelligent failure, that could be the next project you're leading at work, but that could also be, dating, right? I mean, we're trying to find a life
Yeah,
partner.
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
and it's like, yeah, you can't expect, you have to expect some, sort of bumps in the road. So it's like it's a way to think about things in life as well as things at work. So I
Yeah.
like that one a lot. And I suppose because this is our focus on accountability, which is just a concept I love, as a sense of, real psychological ownership.
Yeah.
I also love there's an early graphic on where the vertical dimension is psychological safety and the horizontal dimension is essentially accountability, right? That sense of ownership
Yeah.
and failing well, meaning innovating, learning, growing, teaming with others, is in that upper right-hand quadrant. Like
Yeah.
that's where the magic happens.
Ah, yes. So I can resonate with the joy of coming up with a really good visual. It's so satisfying, right? Because you can convey so much in a short. Also, there's lots of stories, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to. Do you have a favorite story of failure from your book?
It's and thank you for saying, I mean, I think there are a lot of good stories in there, and stories are these, we're wired for story as humans, right? So stories are a great way to make intellectual content memorable and useful, right? So so thank you for that. It's hard, I guess my favorite, I mean, some of the stories are longer and shorter, and so I have different favorites, but sometimes, I really like like a story that makes a concept really simple and straightforward. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna break the rules and give you two. So one is my
Okay.
own story of intelligent failure early in the PhD program, which is what we already talked about with
Yeah.
the error rates, like where I was absolutely hell-bent on showing that better teams had lower errors, and the data failed to show me that, right?
Yeah.
In fact, they seem to be suggesting the opposite. So that failure, that research failure, and it really was, led me to something so much more interesting
Mm,
ultimately, like which was psychological safety. Okay, so
yeah.
that's like, classic research context made a failure, and I think I described that whole journey, the motions of it, and in a
Yeah.
sense, this happy ending, like all good intelligent failures should have some kind of happy ending eventually, not right
Yeah.
away, but eventually. The other one, just because it's so darn simple, is the Citibank 2021. An employee essentially checking the wrong box and accidentally wiring $900 million to a group of lenders. That is a basic failure, right? It's like kind of single human error in familiar territory, leading to a very expensive failure.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. There's also some great stories that you pick up over and over throughout the book, and they continue to illustrate the point. So those
Right,
are
right, right, right.
wonderful. So
Oh, and
yeah.
I just have to give a little tiny shout out to Madame Clicquot, right? Isabelle Ponsardin Clicquot, who is the founder of the Veuve Clicquot Champagne, this
Oh,
very, very
yes.
successful business and brand. And her story, late 1700s, early 1800s, is just littered with failures, some of them so painful and devastating, and she perseveres and becomes this remarkable entrepreneur who more than just has a
Yeah.
successful business, she creates an industry.
If there's not a movie about that, that would be an incredible
You
movie.
know what? There is a movie that just came out last year, but it's not very. I shouldn't say this. You can decide whether to include this or not, but it's not very good. It's got lots and lots of stuff thrown into it that wasn't part of her real journey.
Yeah.
But it's whatever. It's still
Well,
fun.
if you
I
don't like
think a
that
better
movie,
movie. There could be a better movie.
if people don't like that movie, they can
Yeah.
read your script, which is in the book.
There you
Um,
go.
okay, before we wrap this up, I want to connect your book to some current things going on and just see where your brain's at. Failure and AI.
Oh,
What are your thoughts?
my thoughts are that AI is ripe for complex failures, right? And complex failures happen when a handful of interconnected or interrelated elements combine in an unexpected way. And I am surprised by how little conversation we have about the potential for unexpected, undesired,
Mm,
complex failures with AI. I'm not saying don't do it, button it back
yeah,
up, put it back in the box, right? But I'm
yeah,
saying we had better be extraordinarily thoughtful about this potential for breakdowns.
yeah. And
And
when you read the book and understand what complex failures are, it'll make a lot of sense what you're saying because
yep, chapter
AI is
4.
being entrusted with a lot of variables all at the same time
Yeah,
that can
right.
conspire.
It's as
Okay,
if it's as
yeah,
if it's like familiar territory. It's
yeah,
not.
yeah. And if we're lured into thinking it is, and we're looking at it through the wrong lens, okay, shifting gears, you talk briefly about inequity in permission to fail. And will you say a little bit about kind of in the context of inclusion and what's going on in our culture right now?
Yeah, it's this is what I think the section title in the book is the unequal license to fail.
Mm,
And it's the problem is, let's put it this way. If you are a member of an underrepresented group in some environment, let's say senior executives, right? That's a group where, more senior executives around the world or at least let's just stick to the US, are going to be white men than any other category. So let's say you're promoted to a senior executive role, and there really hasn't been anyone else who looks like you. And now let's say, you fail in some material way in that role. People's brains, like it or not, even good people, will instantly go to, oh, that's what happens when you put such and such category into that role. It's not true. I mean, it's very unlikely to be true. It's but no one would ever say. So here's the sort of the thought experiment. No one would ever say when there's a significant failure by some executive, well, we never should have put a white man in that role, right? I mean, like, oh,
right.
really? No, that's just silly,
Yeah.
right? So it's,
Yeah.
in other words, people are likely to attribute the failure to your group membership rather than to consequences or
Yeah.
situations outside your control or any number of other things.
Yeah.
Therefore, there's an unequal license to fail because you are at greater risk if you're underrepresented of having the failure attributed to your group. And that makes you very risk averse because people are conscious of owning that burden. And so they don't want to put others in
Yeah.
their community at
Oh,
risk. And so they will be more,
yeah.
cautious.
So have you seen the movie? I think it's 688 about the first Black women
Yes,
infantry. What a great
yes,
example of
yeah.
unequal license to fail.
Oh, it
And
was
and
so
oh,
frustrating.
such
Yeah.
a great movie though
The
about
great story, right? I mean, I saw it not that long ago and it made me want to read up. I haven't done it yet, but it made me want to read up on because it's based on a true story. And it just seems like they solved a remarkably hard problem. Talk about complex failure. The whole mail system was a
yeah,
complex
yeah, yeah,
failure.
yeah. Oh,
And they solved it even though they were just, treated badly at every turn.
oh, everything from the perfume to the way they figured out how to track these soldiers,
Yeah, it
and
was
it was
brilliant.
amazing.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so this may be a really touchy topic. Have you been asked or have you thought about how we respond to the plane crash in DC?
Um, First, the very first thing I'll say is we let the investigators do their job. They're extraordinarily good at it.
Yeah,
And that would be almost necessarily example of a complex failure. We could be proven wrong. Like tomorrow or 6 months, we could be proven wrong, and someone could say, "Oh, make it basic failure by saying, the pilot was drunk."
yeah,
But I am extremely sure that will not be the case, right? So what will happen is this will be shown to be a complex failure, but a complex failure that was the chances of which were increased by profoundly low staffing, right?
right.
The half one air traffic controller doing both the helicopters and the commercial flights. That's just not right.
Right.
So that could, that
Yeah.
that's certainly a causal factor. It's probably not the only causal factor because no other planes crashed that night and that person was, so we know it needed other things to happen. We have heard that the helicopter was higher than it's supposed to be. We don't know why, right? So, I will predict we'll end up with a kind of short to medium-sized list of factors that were deviations from appropriate or best practice that conspired to create this tragic failure.
Yeah. Hard stuff. Thank you for just sharing your thoughts on that. And Amy, we could go in so many different directions. Your candor, your wealth of information, and just your journey is such a great example of learning from failure. I want to kind of close with sharing how a principle that I learned from one of my colleagues, Jamie Remsburg. She's a master facilitator on adventure courses, ropes courses, and you create these experiences where people are going to fail. And
exactly,
how do you set it up for maximum outcomes? And we also do a lot of work around self-efficacy and how do you raise self-efficacy for failure? And she said, coping role models are way more powerful than mastery role models. Coping role models are living examples of intelligent failure, whereas mastery role models always do it perfect. And when we watch them, we don't learn anything about how to fail well. So, Amy, thank you for being a wonderful role model of coping, of a coping role model for the rest of us, and for writing about it and sharing all that you've learned. Is there any last thing you'd like to share about kind of what's coming up for you as you share about this book, as you talk about it, as you are out there hearing people respond to this message?
No, I just want to say what a pleasure it has been to talk with you about it. I feel heard and I'm hearing from you, and I love Jamie's insight. That's a very powerful one, and I will take it to heart because I think it's really important for people, especially in leadership positions, to know that they are even more impactful and their model is even more important and influential when they're struggling and coping and problem solving aloud than when they're, nailing it, crushing it.
Well, if compassion means to struggle with others, how can people struggle with us if they don't know what we're struggling with?
Right.
And wonderful. Thank you again so much. Appreciate you. Appreciate the work you're doing. And thanks for making time today.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Compassionate Accountability Podcast. What struck you? What can you take and use today? I'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't done so already, pick up a copy of my new book, Compassionate Accountability: How Leaders Build Connection and Get Results. If you've already read the book, will you leave a review on Amazon? Want to learn more? From enterprise solutions to executive training, train the trainer certification to our signature Compassion Mindset e-course, Next Element helps companies transform their cultures with compassionate accountability. Contact us today. And remember, embracing both compassion and accountability is the secret to great leadership and the roadmap for thriving cultures and strong brands.